Welcome, everyone. Love to introduce Peter Barrage. There you go. Let's hit it off.
All right, we're going to give it a start here. So, does that show up okay for you?
It does.
Nice. Thank you so much for joining us today. And oftentimes when we start off, we want to do a little bit of a centering. And so the way that we're going to do that is actually this really nice video. Can you see it okay there, Jenny?
Nope, we still see your PowerPoint.
So just take a couple of moments to let this soak in.
In Tokyo, Japan, there was a restaurant whose elderly waiters and waitresses all suffered from varying degrees of memory loss. It was the brainchild of Shiro Oguni, who had visited a group home for adults with dementia and thought that their isolation was kind of heartbreaking. He reckoned there really ought to be room to keep them included in society, so he created the Restaurant of Mistaken Orders, where the waiters and waitresses were all struggling with memory loss, but were nevertheless performing a job that required very good memory. And yes, 37% of the time, the orders were wrong, but 99% of the time, the guests left quite happy. Of course they did. There's a very old folk tale about a woman who would carry water home every day from a river, using 2 buckets at either end of a bamboo pole. And one of the buckets was new and solid, and the other was much older and had developed some small leaks. And when the woman would finally get the buckets home, the new bucket would still have all of its water, but the old bucket had lost almost half. And the old bucket felt very badly about this and apologized to the woman, saying how sorry it was that it could no longer do its job very well. So the woman turned and pointed back down the road and said to the old water bucket, "You see all those flowers growing on your side of the road? Every day you water those flowers, and my walk to and from the river is always filled with beauty." Oguni-san, ohana o arigatou gozaimashita.
Nice. So I'd like to just settle in and prime you all for a nice conversation today. And I hope it's an active conversation. You've taken time out of your busy schedule, and I am very appreciative of that. I'd like to introduce Andrew Bridger, who's helping me here today as well, and is going to be watching the chat box. So if you've got any sort of questions, and he'll be posting information there. And then also Jenny Peterson, who just introduced me. And so welcome to you all. So she's helping out here as well. By background, I grew up in the field of human resources and spent about 20 years doing that here in Minneapolis at a place called Courage Center, where I was the head of human resources and was there for 17 years. After that, becoming an executive coach through the Hudson Institute in 2006, and then pursuing a degree in applied positive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. And that led me to want to fix something that had been troubling, this idea of feedback and why it's so difficult, why it's so hard. And it led to the development of the Shift Positive method. And Change Positive, the organization that I run, we have this mission, which is really to bring together positive psychology and social support to transform this experience of feedback, to work to embrace and create cultures that allow for open dialogue, that allow people to become allies in each other's professional development. And the things that we do are we train coaches in this methodology and leadership development professionals. We transform cultures through constructive feedback by conducting the Shift Positive 360, by holding manager workshops and teaching feedback skills, by doing staff training for everybody in the organization, for facilitating teams and executive teams, and actually helping organizations with their operational systems. So that's a little bit about what we do. And here are some of the people that really help with that, some of our partners in this work that we do. and some of the organizations in which we do it, where the shift positive method has been used, where we've done our work. So as we start to get you involved, I want you to think about somebody that is important to you. Bring them to mind. And I want you to think about feedback that you have for them and actually write it down. And this is somebody that maybe you work with, somebody personally, maybe you have a little bit of a challenge with them, but just jot down quickly feedback that you have for them. So as I see heads starting to come back up, the question I have for you is this. Could you say that to them? Would you be able to share that feedback that you have with them? And go ahead and put that in the chat. Yes, not as bluntly as I have written it down. I would not share it as I wrote it. Yes. Same on the bluntly. Bluntly seems to be getting a pretty big share here. Not sure the feedback, and it did not. I did, and it did not go well. Oh, Keisha. Yes, but I'd be afraid of hurting feelings. I was blunt.
Yeah, and Rebecca said if she was feeling very bold.
Bold. Okay. So feedback impacts our relationships with our partners, our children, our friends, our coworkers, that ability to really share with someone else, that ability to have that dialogue. So just think about that for a moment. What might it do for you if you take even a small amount of the information from today and you put that into practice? How might that help just a little bit? So believe that feedback is broken. And that's why I focus on this. I don't think it's because of poor intent. We design feedback systems in organizations because we want people to be their best selves, to learn, to grow, to be their best selves. But that's not how it is experienced. And I don't think it's because of poor intention. I think it's because primarily of design flaws. So first, feedback is often tied to promotion, a raise, something like that. And that compromises intent. It gets muddled. Second, it's almost always confidential. And so we don't know the context of it. We don't know the tone in which it's shared with us. And we tend to take it in a more negative tone than perhaps how it would actually have been spoken to us. Also, the focus becomes on what's not working. Even if there's a whole lot of things around it that feedback is things that people appreciate about us, what we focus in on is what's not working, what seems to be broken. And finally, feedback systems often lack ongoing support from those stakeholders. Once it's given, it's rarely tracked and followed up on or noticed. And that leaves people feeling unclear, discouraged, isolated, and as though their colleagues are against them rather than with them. So that's from a design standpoint. Also, from a delivery standpoint, I think that feedback is broken. And we know this from Tom Rath's research and his book, StrengthsFinder 2.0, that if a supervisor focuses on an employee's strengths, the probability of them becoming actively disengaged is only 1 in 100, 1%. If what's striking is if the supervisor focuses on the employee's weaknesses, 22% of those employees become actively disengaged. So what drives the most disengagement? Where does that come from? The research shows that actively disengaged report that they did not receive any feedback whatsoever, that their manager simply ignored them. So we struggle to give feedback, and then we don't give feedback, and that's actually the worst thing that we can do. The idea that no news is good news is simply wrong. So what makes the delivery of feedback broken? All too often, feedback isn't happening, and when it is, it's done poorly because of those design features talked about earlier. So we must change feedback to be the positive and constructive experience that we intend it to be. A little bit more about feedback, the state of feedback. If you dig into the research about it, almost everybody has had a bad experience with feedback. We don't need to go further than our own personal experiences, but the research shows that more than a third of feedback interventions actually lead to a decrease in performance, the exact opposite effect that we want to have happen. And that leads to increased disengagement, poor individual and team performance, discouragement, frustration, turnover, and so forth. So this is where, in studying positive psychology, and through experimentation and continual refinement and feedback from the people who have been working with this methodology, we've been making change. So what is feedback at its best? I think this is what feedback at its best is. When you trust the intention of the person that's sharing it with you is truly for your benefit. And there's context to the feedback. You understand circumstances. You understand when and where and in what way. And the feedback is developmental rather than evaluative. So it's about your growth. It's not about evaluating your performance. So if we separate developmental feedback from performance feedback, and we're focusing here primarily on developmental feedback and being clear about that, that makes it much easier. When you understand also what to do rather than what not to do. And also it is how to leverage your strengths in those areas of your growth, in those areas of your development, when it's done in a timely manner and when you have the social support going forward, when people say that they'll be there with you to support you in that developmental area. So let's dig into first a little bit more about what makes feedback hard. And really it comes down to our physiology and our psychology. We think we ought to be able to just do it. We ought to be able to just say what needs to be said, but that ignores how we're actually built, what our physiology is. So I'm going to touch on a few of those areas. The first one being about mindset. How many of you are familiar with the work of Carol Dweck in talking about mindset? Since the cameras mostly are off. Oh, Heather, thanks. Yeah, raising your hand there. I see that. Kathleen, you are. Good. Amy, and go ahead and put it in the chat if you're familiar with her work. I'll do just a high-level summary of it here. But Carol Dweck had this theory that focused on two theories of intelligence. That intelligence is either a fixed trait, we're kind of born with, kind of what we're going to have, and she termed that the fixed mindset, or that intelligence is malleable. It continues to grow and change based on how we stretch this growth mindset. And her findings are that the person's belief about intelligence impacts their effort, their risk-taking, their persistence, and their defensiveness and their performance. That when people are using a fixed mindset, they'll choose low challenge, low opportunities, and see failure as a reflection on them as a person. But people using a growth mindset see high challenge, high risk opportunities as part of learning. They see failure as part of learning. That this is just another step toward growth. And so what leads to a fixed or a growth mindset in her research? Feedback. How kids receive feedback from their teachers, from their parents. If the feedback was about them as a person, you're so smart, you're so brave, you're so this, you're so that, then those individuals ended up developing more of a fixed mindset. If instead the feedback they received from teachers, parents, and so forth was about their effort, how did you study for that? How did you get that B? What did you do to lead up to that experience on the team? Then they saw that effort as what leads to growth, what leads to performance, and they tended to not be so worried about the label, but more about that next step. So how we offer encouragement or feedback is very important. Rather than focusing on the individual, they are this, they are that, we want to be focusing on the efforts, the behaviors, those specific things that work for them, and what is their next, what is their growth. The second area that I'll touch on relating to our mind is really in the area of neuroscience. And David Rock does a nice summary of this. He kind of coined this phrase, SCARF. And basically, in looking at research done under an fMRI of how the brain responds to social threats. What happens in the brain when somebody experiences a social threat? And those social threats can be things like impact on status, or when we experience uncertainty, or when we don't feel a sense of autonomy, when we don't have control over our world, or when relatedness, when we feel like relationships or we don't belong. That's why belonging is so important, or a sense of fairness when somebody is being treated unfairly. What happens in those circumstances, at the same areas of the brain light up under the fMRI as light up when we experience physical threats. In fact, even physical pain. So those same regions light up where we experience suffering. And so when you think about providing feedback to somebody, their brain is tuned in looking for any sort of threat to their status. Like, we're going to change your title, we're going to change who reports to you, and we're going to have you focus in this area rather than that area. But don't worry, we're not going to change your pay. Or somebody leaves the organization and we're really close to them and we think maybe I should leave too, because that relatedness, that sense of relatedness has changed. Or we're experiencing uncertainty in maybe a time of layoff. And so that uncertainty leads our brain just to ping. So while we think logically we ought to be able to handle those situations, that's simply not how we respond in a physiological way. And then I'm sure many of you are familiar with the negativity bias. And so this idea that negative emotions are stronger than positive and potential threats grab our attention. That is an evolutionary adaptation. It's why we're still padding around on the earth. Because if we pay attention to what the potential threats are, it's more likely that we'll actually be able to survive as a species. And so I like how Marty Seligman, I was back on the University of Pennsylvania campus a number of years ago, and Marty was describing the negativity bias. And he said, the negativity bias is like our tongue. Our tongue is forever cruising around our mouth, and it's looking for any sort of intruder. And when it finds that popcorn husk, that's where it's going to go. It's going to try to dislodge that popcorn husk. That's what our brain is like. It's looking for that threat and trying to ameliorate that threat. Or how Dan Tomasolo, a friend of mine, describes it. He said, Rog and Grog are standing outside of a cave entrance, and they hear a noise inside. And Rog says, I think I'm going to go investigate. And Grog says, oh, not me. So we're descendants of Grog, not Rog, because of that ability to look for those potential threats. So as he describes, we need to overcome this biological adaptation that we have. We need to look toward the positive. We need to be able to move past this reaction that we're going to have. So how does this relate to feedback then? We're actually going to look at two areas here today. We're going to look at positive psychology and social support. These are the two underlying premises that really create the shift positive approach. Under positive psychology, we're going to be talking about strengths, solution-focused feedback, desired outcomes. And under social support, we're going to talk about the importance of allyship and creating two-way accountability and getting away from confidentiality to move to openness and transparency. So we want to start then with strengths. And strengths, as we just mentioned, are really important. I want to come back to this research by Tom Rath, that the idea of giving feedback on people's strengths is one of the easiest things we can do to help increase their engagement, to help in their development and growth. Focusing on strengths is not likely to result in their disengagement, but ignoring them will. So oftentimes in organizations, we think about strengths, and kind of the message that I hear is strengths, 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 all the time strengths. How do we leverage people's strengths? But I want to actually refine that a little bit and help you to refine your perspective of strengths. So work by Robert Biswas-Diener, he talks about strengths in a little bit more specific way. In this way, he said, strengths are, think about a sailboat metaphor. The sailboat has two main components. It's got the ship itself, the hull of the ship, and then it's got the sail. And if you have a hole in your hull, you need to pay attention to that. So that's the weakness, but you really only need to pay attention to it to the extent that that water is coming in. How fast is it coming in? If there's a big hole, and that's a derailer. You better pay attention. You better start bailing. You better start fixing that. But he said, even if your hole is whole, it doesn't mean that you're going anywhere. It's your strengths that give you power, that give you direction, that allow you to move forward, leveraging those strengths that you have. And at the same time, you need to hoist your sail relative to the conditions so that you don't end up turtling the boat. Second, he talks about, as a refinement, the situational and the social use of strengths, that you need to understand the situation that you're in the social aspect of your strengths. Who are you with socially? Who's in the room with you? So somebody might be an ideator and they're in the room with a critical thinker and they'll start to drive each other nuts. And yet the situation, there is a time to do the blue sky thinking, the ideation, and then there's a time to decide, to cut bait, and to actually move forward and to put it into action. So being cognizant of who you're with and then being intentional about what does the situation call for? What strengths now? As a way of refining thinking about our strengths. And where we really want to go is this idea. How do you not just understand your strengths as a way to feel good, but how do you utilize your strengths in an area of your development? And be really intentional about that as a doorway to your growth. For example, oftentimes we have a technical leader that moves from a technical expert into a team lead role or a first level supervisor manager role. And they continue to try to problem solve and become a bottleneck. But instead, if we take that analytical strength that they've got and we repoint that toward the people that they have, and what are the strengths of those individuals, the passions of those people, and they use those analytical skills to create a great team instead of a great product, that's a way of leveraging those strengths as a doorway in their own development as a leader. So being thoughtful about our strengths is something that we can do as a first way to improve feedback. So in the materials, in the chat, there's actually a document that we want you to download. And it has strengths, growth, and allyship. And so we're going to give you a moment to download that if you haven't done that already. Good, Andrew, just put it back in there again. Oh, nice. Catherine, your daughter's school district teaches mindset, fosters it. Yeah, good. I do want to invite you to come off mute anytime that you have a question as well. And also, Andrew is looking at the chat because I want to stop and not just be talking at you for a long period of time here. I'd love to hear your questions. But if you open that PDF at the top, then I want you to think about somebody in your sphere that's important to you. It might be the person that you came up with in the opening question or someone else, but it should be someone with whom your success is interdependent. And you're going to use them throughout an exercise, a 3-part exercise today. And the first part is this: think of that individual and then write down what it is that you really love about them. When they're at their absolute best, what are they doing? What are their greatest strengths? If you can, it's great if you can identify quotes, things they say that illustrate their strengths, or behaviors that they do or where they do that, specific examples of when they showed that particular strength. So it's not just a concept. We're not just working from concepts like communication, authenticity, strategic agility, whatever that might be, executive presence, whatever that might be, but rather we're working from behaviors. What are those behaviors that they show? All right. So as I see eyes come up, then I would love to have somebody come off of mute and tell me, just, you don't have to identify the person, but what were the strengths that you saw and how did you describe those strengths?
I'm happy to go. This is Rebecca. I wrote that this person, I didn't do it properly until you gave further guidance. I wrote passion, compassion, and empathy, but what that really means is she truly cares about the people in the organization and their own success and how that ladders up to the overall organization being more successful.
Nice. How does that compassion show up? Give an example.
You could be in a meeting with this person and she is really just focused on what you're saying. She's a great listener and she really, she's not listening just to respond, right? This is a coaching colleague in another organization, and she has sent, I don't know, a dozen people to coaching in our time working together. So she really wants people to be able to develop, which is great.
Nice, nice. So then we went from like this concept down to the specific behaviors. That's great. Because now you can see it in your mind's eye. And actually, if you were sharing that with the individual and you said beyond the passion and compassion and empathy that she actually in a meeting was locked in on you. You could tell that she was really focused on you as an individual, and she cared about development because she acted on it. She actually sent people to get support through coaching. Now she would understand that if she read that beyond just the idea of compassion or a wonderful presence or something like that. Nice.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and thanks for being brave and being willing to come off of mute. So we've identified strengths, the first and perhaps the most important aspect here of feedback. Now we want to go to the second area, which is really about growth. So what you've got here is a tree. This is not a mushroom cloud. This is a tree. And so when we start talking about people's growth, we don't want to be blowing them up. We don't want to be just putting stuff in their face and with radical transparency and those sorts of things. But rather, what we say is that, traditionally after we focus on strengths, what do? We talk about weaknesses, and that's where we tend to struggle. But what if in our approach, we never talked about weaknesses? That's what we do at Shift Positive. We don't talk about weaknesses. We don't focus on those. They might be interesting, informative, or insightful, but they're insufficient for change. You need to go further. We need to go beyond what that thing is that doesn't work for us. And we need to identify what do we want instead. And here's the interesting thing. Generally, people don't know what they want instead. That's the really surprising thing. If you ask people, okay, what's not working, they'll be able to identify that. But if you ask them, what would they do instead? They don't know. They'll say, not that, don't do that, wouldn't do that. But they don't know what they want them to do instead. And so it leaves that person wandering in the wilderness, trying to figure out, what am I supposed to do? And that's why we offer it in a confidential way, because we don't know how to say it. And then they receive it. They don't know what it means. So it's pretty provocative, right? Ignore the weaknesses. Don't talk about weaknesses. But really what it's doing is pointing out the interrelationship between two individuals, that person who's providing feedback needs to go further. Otherwise, they're not being helpful. They need to identify what they want rather than what they don't. And this is not just about being fluffy and positive. We're not just going to stop with strengths, but rather it's about being constructive. We need to ask ourselves, when is the problem not a problem? What does it look like then? So I'll give you an example here. In doing 360 for a client of mine, this is what everybody said. He talks too much, he interrupts others, he dominates meetings, right? He knows that about himself. That's useless information for him. And it's actually useful information for people to offer. And so instead, I need to work with them to go further. What do you want? What would it look like if he were not talking too much, interrupting others, dominating meetings? What would he be doing instead? And they come up with these sorts of things. He'd use active listening skills. He'd ask others for their input. He'd facilitate. Well, what does facilitation look like? He'd pause. He'd use people's first names. He'd ask them what their opinion is. Oh, now I know what facilitation looks like. He'd seek to understand. How do you know he'd seek to understand? He'd ask an open-ended question with true curiosity. How do you know it would be true curiosity? Because I'd see it in his face. I'd see that he nods. I'd see his eyes widen. I'd see that he'd sit back rather than leaning forward. He'd be curious and ask those open-ended questions. Okay, now if I share these things with my client, Now he's got something he can actually try, he can actually do. Okay. So that's what we mean by going further, getting to the solution rather than the problem. So I have a quiz for you. Take a look at this picture. And what do you think of? And go ahead and put that in the chat. What is it that you think of when you see this picture? Eagle, eagle talons. Mm-hmm. Prey, holding on. Nice. Metaphor for typical feedback. it's gonna hurt. Okay. So now what do you see? Put that in the chat. Everybody's adjusting their reading glasses, leaning in. A bat, dragon, fear, what the heck? Cowboy. Ah, there we go. Ah, Heather, I see your face. That was my reaction the first time too. Braden, I see it in you as well. Yeah. So what the heck's going on here? Something called inattentional blindness and priming. So we don't see what we're not looking for. And if I prime you by asking you what needs to be fixed, what's wrong, what's a weakness, you are going to see weaknesses. If instead if I prime you and say, what is it that you want? What would it look like? When is the problem not a problem? What would you see then? What would they be doing? Then you start looking for the solutions. You start looking for the right-hand side. And so unless you take the time to truly think about what success looks like, the person is going to be guessing, and you probably won't recognize the change when it begins to happen because you haven't seen it in your mind's eye already. So Kathleen was in another gathering when that was used. And so now it's hard not to see the cowboy when you go back to the picture, right? So we want to prime people to see what they want rather than what they don't. There are a number of different ways that we could show you inattentional blindness. And it's amazing that the way in which our brain processes stuff, the way in which our vision works, I want you to start looking for the cowboy. I want you to start looking for the behavior you want in that person that's important to you, rather than the behavior that maybe bothers you. So this takes us to the second part of the worksheet that you've got. I want you to think about if that same individual were even more effective, what would they be doing? What would that look like? What do you want them to do? Okay. And how you can do this then is using that worksheet that you've got. If you think of something that isn't working, and that's fine, but go ahead and put it in the left-hand side. What's if the problem shows up for you, write that down by putting it in the left-hand side, but then do the hard work of trying to come up with the right-hand side. What do you want? What would it look like instead? Now, I'll give you some hints as you start writing on the solution focused side that if you're writing words like stop, don't, wouldn't, won't, or other sorts of NTs like that, you're not there yet. If it's stop this, don't that, and so forth, keep going. What would you see? What would show up in those instances? What would you see? If they were even more effective, what would be that small step they would take? Insect. Hmm. Cool. So now I want to help one of you with this. Okay. Rebecca, would it be okay if I called on you? Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's do a little demo here for folks. And I'm going to stop share for just a second so we can all kind of see there. So for the person that you were thinking about, Rebecca, was there anything on that left-hand side that you would have them change?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen instances of her be visibly frustrated with a colleague's performance. I don't want to say performance, that's too generic, but how they show up in doing their role day to day.
Okay.
So her frustration can be tangible.
Okay. And so now let's talk about the right-hand side. If what would be the solution to that? What would you see instead how they would show up, even in those situations when that third person isn't showing up the way that they would want?
Yeah. What I wrote is active coaching.
Okay.
That's also very vague. So
yeah, what would that look like?
Yeah, I think she could do more to just I mean, she cares, right? That's why she gets frustrated, because she cares about the delivery, right? But turn that caring around and focus it on the person, right?
Okay.
They're not delivering for some reason that's probably systemic or related to them having a bad day, or like there's something going on there, right?
Yeah.
So have some curiosity about what's going on.
Oh, there we go. So, and what would that curiosity look like? Because you've probably seen curiosity from her before, right?
Yeah. Just ask those caring questions, right? Demonstrate caring questions.
Like what? Give an example.
Let's say, so in this example, the person who wasn't showing up terrifically was in the midst of delivery on a very high visibility project, with a lot of eyes on her, and just, became flustered and maybe not the best delivery of her message and her plan.
Okay.
Can you give her space to get her frustration under control? Can
Good,
you
good. So what would the space look like? Describe this.
maybe just, yeah.
What would
This
she
isn't
look?
a bigger meeting, right? So
Mhm.
can you redirect the focus to a different agenda item to give her time to get things back under control so that she feels confident in delivery again?
Redirect, give her a little bit of time. Okay. And what would she look like as she's doing that, interacting with this other individual?
I think that she herself would appear calm. That's
Which
really
looks
the main,
yeah,
I
which
think,
looks like what?
quality that would
Yeah,
just grounded,
yeah. Uh-huh.
sitting back right here. I just did it, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Yeah, grounded, sitting back, just chilling, demonstrating the chill, right?
Mhm.
Trying to model some behavior that you would like the other person to
Yeah.
adopt. Yeah.
Yeah. So what all did you see in Rebecca as I asked those continued questions? What was the change you saw in Rebecca?
It became clearer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you could see and almost measure the behavior,
Mm-hmm. And Rebecca, if those behaviors happened, if she sat back, if she gave a little bit more time by redirecting to another area, would you notice that?
I think it would be tangible.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if the entire room would consciously notice it, but I think that's the kind of change in behavior that,
Would you notice it?
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah.
There. Okay, good. So the reason I asked that question now is because now Rebecca sees it in her mind's eye. She sees the cowboy. So when it happens, she's going to be one of the people that reinforces it. And it's going to be easier to say, boy, I'd love it when somebody's stressed out in the meeting. If I know you're more effective when you sit back, you give them a little bit of time by redirecting the room, and then you ask one of those curious questions that you've got that demonstrates the care that you have. And she's going to be able to describe it more easily, but also when it happens, the first time it happens, Rebecca's going to almost unintentionally reinforce it behaviorally. That's why it's so important to get to that solution side, because we don't change by ourselves. We change through the interactions and feedback we give each other on a regular basis. And when she says, oh yeah, I'd see it, then we know that she's going to see it, right? We see that physical change. Whereas if it were instead, she'd be a good coach. I don't know what a good coach is yet. Or she'd be more compassionate or whatever. Until you get down to that behavioral detail, you haven't seen it in your mind's eye. You haven't seen the bird, or excuse me, you haven't seen the cowboy through that, what somebody described as an insect. Yuck. Thanks, Carolyn. Yeah. So Rebecca, you did awesome. Everybody owes you a great deal of gratitude. So let's send some love out to Rebecca in the chat. And thank you. So we'll come back here, and you did wonderful. So this gives you the opportunity then to practice for your own individual. What we want you to do is just take a couple of moments and, well, actually, we just kind of went through this here. So I'm going to move us forward to our next area. All right. What you'll find on that sheet, if you were doing this with somebody else, are the simple questions that I was asking. What would it look like? What would you see? What do you want to see instead? What are those behaviors? Is there an example? When is the problem not a problem? What would you notice? What's the small step? And thank you, Rebecca, for letting me interrupt you so frequently to just help you to get to that, nudge you to that place of the actual behaviors. Okay. You can do this with yourself. You can do this with somebody else when they come to you in the HR department and they go, oh, a manager shows up and they've got this difficulty with an employee and I need them to fix this thing. Okay. Well, what would that look like? What would you see? What would they be doing? You just keep asking that over and over and over until they get clear in their mind's eye. And then it's like, and could you share that with them? Yeah, probably. And if that happened, would you notice? Yes. Good. Okay. Now you can leave. So that's getting to that solution side, that right side of the T-chart. So again, it's not intended to be fluffy and all positive and to skim over things that aren't working, but instead it's intended to be constructive. The third main part here is about allyship. And the key here is this, what we started to see: change does not happen alone. We know this from the research. From Marshall Goldsmith, he did research in looking at coaching interventions, and those individuals that shared their goals with the people around them were the people that ended up being perceived as having made change. Those that did not, did not. So it's crucial that we've got other people in our development with us. The research that I really appreciate and enjoy is this from 4 researchers, Schnall, Harber, Stefanucci, and Profit. And what they found is that with social support, we see slopes as less steep and we feel burdens to be less heavy. They ran experiments where they had individuals come by, and when somebody was by themselves, they had them stand in front of a hill and they had them look at the slope of that hill and estimate how steep it was. And then when people came by in pairs, they had them stand in front of the hill. They had one person stand away, 3 feet away, looking the other direction. And they asked the individual that was facing the hill, how steep is it? And they had that person estimate it. And what they found is that the person that had somebody simply standing next to them, not saying anything, not offering anything, they saw that hill to be 10 to 20% less steep. Just having somebody stand by us leads us to see physical experiences in a less daunting way. And then they had people come by and they primed them. They primed them to think, individuals by themselves, primed them to think about somebody that was supportive of them, neutral, or a detractor for them. And again, those people that were thinking of somebody that was more supportive saw the hill in front of them as being 10 to 20% less steep than those thinking of somebody that was neutral or a detractor. So what would it be like if every day you felt you had 10 to 20% more support, or you felt your job 10 to 20% lighter because somebody else was in it with you? They were helping you on your path of development. So I love how they end their research, this article. They say, if social support, opportunities for emotional disclosure, and differences in hope, optimism, self-worth, and self-efficacy cause people to see challenges in a more moderate way, then people who enjoy these resources will live in a subjectively less demanding and less stressful world. Conversely, those deprived of such resources will live in a world where hills are steeper, distance is greater, precipices deeper, and other kinds of physical challenges more daunting and demanding. So what we do then is we say, don't expect change to happen unless you're willing to be part of it. It takes more than just the person receiving the feedback to create change. Feedback is relative and relational to the person that's offering it. What Andrew is looking for from me is going to be different than what another coworker is looking for from him. Okay. And so we need to be in it with those individuals. So when we do a 360, for example, we ask everybody that we're interviewing, not only what are the strengths, what is next, the growth in your relationship with them, what they can do to be more effective, but also what is one thing that you're willing to do to support them? One overt commitment you'll make to them in their professional development. And what I like about this is that responsibility of the person that's providing the feedback, that they need to be in it with them, because we can't simply give feedback to an individual, expect them to change, and then they go back to an unchanged environment. A friend of mine, another coach, Jessa Mortgage, said, you can't take a cucumber and put it in a jar of vinegar and expect it not to become a pickle. So we work very hard to coach individuals, to be with them, to help them develop. And then they go back to an environment where nobody knows what they were working on. Nobody is there to support that. Nobody signed up for that and supporting them. And so those behaviors can fade. That's why we need to be overt. We need to be open. We need to be able to share what it is that individual is working on, or they need to share what they're working on, and to have those allies supporting them. So what that means for you then, in the third aspect of that worksheet that was given to you, is what is one thing, one commitment you can make to support that individual in their success? So if we go back to the example, for example, with Rebecca, if you're in those meetings with her, what might you be able to do? Could you notice that? Could you reinforce that? Would you be willing to have a debrief, a little 5-minute walk back with her afterwards and say, I love it when you did this, when you sat back and you used her first name and you took that deep breath and you said, just take a minute and compose yourself, and then let me come back to you. The impact that had on the room. You can become that kind of an ally. And then it doesn't need to be confidential. It doesn't need to be a secret. So go ahead and write down on your sheet the person that you've got some feedback for. How might you become their ally? What specifically could you do to support them? Okay. So I kind of hinted at the last part, which is how do we become these allies? So in our approach with the Shift Positive 360, by the end of the process, the client is going to have 6, 8, 10, 12 people around them that are all willing to do one thing specifically to support them, an overt commitment that they've made to that individual. And it makes it much more easy for them to make change then, because they've got those people that are nudging them and reinforcing in real time. What this takes us to then is the idea of shifting to a system of openness. We need to shift to that system of openness. Useful feedback has context and intention. We know what to do. And so it's about talking to people, not talking about people. We have this saying that when we don't know how to say something constructively, we say it confidentially. We challenge this notion of confidentiality. We believe that it's a symptom of a broken system. It's part of those design failures. But when you do know how to say something constructively, when you do know how to say, in this example with Rebecca, I'd love it to see you lean back, to take that deep breath, to allow that person to have a little bit of space in the room, because then they'll be able to present themselves more fully. And I think it'll have a nice impact on the room. Then it doesn't need to be confidential. Sharing the solution is much easier than sharing the problem. It's just that we need to go through that process to get there. So let's pull this all together then. If you think about what you wrote down on your sheet, could you share the feedback that you have? And how would it feel to be able to do that yourself? So go ahead and put that in the chat. With what you've come up with, do you think that you could share the strengths, what they could do to be even more effective from your perspective, simply relative to you, and that you'll support them in that, in a way that you could support them? Nice. Definitely. Yes, it feels good, empowering them, feeling comfortable, building trust. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah. Actually more excited to share this with them. Thank you, Braden. Yeah. It's not that complicated, but it does take understanding and intention to get to that place because of the strength of that negativity bias, how our brain operates, that scarf. And so it's overcoming that biology to get to that place where we don't need the traditional design issues that you see here. So the shift positive method is different. It is a focus on strengths. It's a focus on building on past successes and what to do more of. It gives specific context and specific behaviors of what you want more of and what those solutions are rather than the problems. We don't need to go into the problems to understand the solutions. We don't need to explain what's on the left-hand side to convey what's on the right-hand side. It gets to that desired behavior and creates then two-way accountability. I'm in it with you. And then with that, then it can be open, transparent, and we can create this allyship. So what we want you to do is dig into strengths. Take the time to think about what to do, that solution focus, become an ally, and be open so that there's context to the feedback. It's these simple 3 steps. Focus on strengths, growth, and allyship. Just taking those away can help you a great deal. So what do we do? How do we help? These might be the kinds of things that are going on for you. You might have a leader that wants to develop and is looking for insight and support. You might be a coach or leadership development or OD professional who wants a better way to conduct 360s in your organization, or simply wants to take a fresher look at all of your feedback systems. You have a team that's struggling to give feedback to each other, and it's affecting then their staff that report to them. Or a leader wants feedback from their team, and you just know that from past experiences, the system you've got isn't going to be working very well. Or you have a leader that struggles to give feedback to their people, especially with performance reviews coming up. How am I going to say this? Can I just write it down, slide the paper to them, or hit send on the email and hope that they sign off on it? Or you're trying to change the culture of your organization. Or you're looking for a book to read. So there's the plug for the book, okay? All of this information is in the book Feedback Reimagined, which I'll show here in a moment. But here are some of the things that we have coming up at Change Positive around the Shift Positive methodology. We have an intro to certification if you're interested in that. And I think that Andrew is putting all of these links into the chat for you. And that's just an opportunity to come and learn more about what would it be like to get certified in the Shift Positive 360. For coaches and leadership development professionals, we have a certification that's coming up in November. And then we have manager training available to help those managers to actually learn some of these concepts and to get better at this. We have another webinar coming up in November, and it's about inspiring change. We're going to go deeper into that solution-focused feedback where you actually get the opportunity to practice in breakouts and to do some more of that solution-focused, hone your skills as a coach to be able to do that. And if you just want to talk and get together, then send me an email. So here's a little bit about the book, the materials that we've got that I've just described to you, and many stories and so forth of how this worked in organizations. It's called Feedback Reimagined, Transform Your Organization Through Positive Psychology and Social Support. And with that, then I just want to open it up for Q&A. Q&A or just
I had a question.
thoughts.
So when you have someone, what I do is I come into businesses and sometimes I'm coaching teams with people in the wrong role. And you want to coach people, you want to give them an opportunity, but sometimes it's like they have some pretty serious challenges.
Yeah.
And so being the ally, like, yes, I want you to change, grow, do all those things, but there is the possibility that they can't do it. How do you think about that in this conversation so that they don't hear this person's going to make sure that I succeed? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So it is good. It's a really good question about how do you get that across if a person really isn't the right match for that role, or it seems like they're not the right match for the role. And a couple of things with that, if I've understood it correctly. One is it's going to give them the best opportunity if you can actually broach those really hard areas by getting to what the solutions are. So, for example, I mean, go ahead and share like what would be what you would see as a derailing behavior of a leader and making them wonder if it's the right match for them.
I'm working with somebody right now who's just too tactical and not strategic enough. So way down in some things that are not impacting business performance. And he really needs to level up and drive the entire business.
Yep. There's one of those great terms, level up. We got to level up. Good. So this approach is going to do a couple of things. One, it's going to allow people to actually say what needs to be said, but to do it, you're going to actually be nudging them so that there's the greatest opportunity for them to, for that individual to succeed, because each one of those individuals has been able to identify what does leveling up mean to you. So if you're interviewing them and they say, it's just too tactical, not strategic. Okay, what's strategic? What would strategic be? When you've experienced it, that they have been strategic, what did it look like then? Or you've experienced it in other places, what did that look like? Because then when you're sitting down with that person, you can say, people are looking for more strategic from you. But this is what that really means. They mean you should be externally focused. You should be talking to the membership. You should be out there looking at where we should be expanding in the 5-state region or whatever it is. And it makes it very plain what those behaviors are. And without that, then it could be hard to succeed in this role. That's what the company needs. How do you feel about that? So what you're doing is really opening it up so that they see what it takes to be successful. And that then makes the match conversation easier. Is this where you want to be? Is this what you want to be doing?
Yeah, I like that. Okay, thank you.
Nice to see you, Jen.
Good to see you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Really great.
Not a question, but a comment. That I use this approach a lot with my daughter. Just trying to share more of, how do I see more of that in her? And when can I reward, when that shows up, like just sort of comment, oh, that's great. I saw you using your planner to plan your homework. That's amazing. Like what great organizational skills you're building. Instead of like, what's your homework? When does it do? Like sort of like the riding her. It's more like, hey, that's awesome. What else is in your planner?
Nice. And what's really great about that is when you say the word planner, I can, in the comment you made to her, I can see it in my mind's eye. You're watching her and saying, oh, great, you're using your planner.
Yeah.
And so it's about it's about the effort. It's not about her being a smart kid or a study hard or an excellent student. It's about, oh, your planner. Nice. Wonderful.
Yeah,
Heather.
it's really funny. We had a faculty meeting this morning. I work at a school, and we were talking about comment writing, and I said it was from these psychologists, Rob Evans and Michael Thompson. They have this notion of claiming the child, and they talked about, and I was sharing that with the faculty, that when you write a comment, if you just say something like, oh, they're a good artist, that's sort of this very general thing. But if you say, I noticed when they were painting that they used a variety of color, then you're putting yourself in the picture and having this very specific thing. And that helps the parents see that you really know their child. And I was thinking about, that's very applicable to the same thing, as opposed to just saying, oh, you're such a people person. Like, I loved it when you leaned in and hugged this person or something like that.
Uh-huh. And it's amazing because as you and Amy share those examples, you can instantly see it in your mind's eye, the way that you use color. Yeah. So it's that visual aspect of it, of what it is that you're looking for. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Kathleen, you raised your hand.
Yes, I don't, this may be beyond the scope of this webinar, and I could schedule another call with you, Pete. But I love this approach. I've been using it for years, and And at the same time, I coach in a lot of global companies. And I don't know if you're familiar with Erin Meyer's book, The Culture Map. She talks a lot about feedback in there and how different countries' cultures have different approaches to feedback. And so in some of the global companies where I'm coaching, there are some people from other countries that are just not hearing if it's too positive and too focused on strengths, then they think, I've got it made. I'm sailing through and I'm going to get promoted, not realizing that their boss thinks that they've given them really strong critical feedback and that they actually are on their way out the door.
Mm.
And so it's just, I don't know if you can speak
And
to that.
you're saying that that's in using this methodology, or you're saying that that's one of the things that she's identified in looking at cultures and feedback, is that if it's too positive, then they don't get the message that they need to improve.
Yeah, it's not about shift positive. It's generally about in cultures where there's more directness in feedback and not focusing on solutions, and people are used to that. If they don't hear that, then they think that they're just fine and they don't even hear the constructive feedback. So it's different styles kind of.
Yeah. So the thing I'd be really curious about, what's going through my head, is about when we're talking about constructive feedback, are we actually talking about solution-oriented feedback? Because you can be very direct with solution-oriented feedback. We need more of this. We need to see more of that. In order to be successful, I need you to be able to take on this or do this, as Jen was talking about in terms of like the strategic. But getting to that clarity of what are those actual behaviors. I wonder what impact that would have as opposed to providing the strengths-based feedback and not being as specific and direct with what the solutions are. That's what I wonder about. Because I'd be curious about if it's to be successful or to make the next step, this is what we need to see in you. This is what I'm looking for. But it's really being focused on what's the right-hand side.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can have a follow-up conversation, because I think she's talking about some cultures like France, for example, will only focus on the constructive, the solution, whatever, however you want to describe it. They won't start with strengths. They immediately go to, this is what you need to do differently to succeed. So in a culture that's more towards that end of the scale, if they don't hear that and they hear the strengths, they like tune out the rest of it. So it's just something to.
I'll have to check that out. We have been doing this quite a bit globally. I haven't come across that really yet, but I'm certain there's cultural differences. And so I'm always curious about, how will this morph? How will this change? What I think is a misnomer is the idea that we need to hit people in the head with a 2x4 to get their attention, and that's good enough. I told them they need to fix this thing, and then it's their responsibility. Instead, what I'm really influenced by is Marcus Buckingham's work around how feedback is really relative and relational to the person providing it. If you're not in it with them, don't expect them to change. If you're not willing to be part of it and to be an ally for them, to be an active part of that change, it won't happen. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that we can do, is create that allyship around. And honestly, when we developed this process, I really thought that the positive psychology was going to be the bigger aspect of this whole thing. What I find more and more is the more people involve their allies, the more likely it is that those people perceive that change in them. So I'd maybe focus a little bit more on that aspect of it. Those are just my thoughts. Yeah. Thank you. Any others as we close off here? Okay, we better bring it to a close. I want to thank Jenny and Andrew for helping out here. Thank you for participating, and look forward to having you be involved with us more in the future.
Thanks, Pete.
You.
Thank you.
Come in.